Welcome to this retrospective slash review for Pulseman. And just a quick overview of what I want to do for this review, basically. What I do normally when I'm doing my playthrough for a stage-based game like this is I'll use save states throughout the game so that I can, do video by video, uh, split up videos, basically. But then afterwards, what I like to do to give the game a really good fair shot is to go back and play it, as it was originally intended on the original platform. So in this case, basically just sitting down and playing it in one session. Now, to give this game a little bit of credit, one of the things I planned on doing was just basically, and this was last night, I was just basically planning on maybe playing the first 3 stages or so and then calling it quits. But I basically kind of got going in a roll, and I was able to actually beat the game again in one sitting. Having said that, however, it took me about somewhere between two and 2.5 hours basically to completely beat the game. So, back in the day, that's how they would have designed this, is you would have to beat it all in one sitting because there's no battery backup or anything of that nature. So basically, you're looking at, if you want to beat this, the way the developers intended, it's a pretty decent time commitment for one sitting, basically. So keep that in mind. Now, I got a lot of thoughts about the game, and I thought mostly I was like, what would I give this game for the final score? So before I get to that, let me go ahead and get to my thoughts about it. So obviously this was a pre-Pokemon Game Freak game, and if you look at some of the catalog of stuff that they actually did quite a few games for not only Sega but also NEC on the TurboGrafx, if I'm not mistaken, before Nintendo scooped them up and they became basically a Nintendo branded company at that point. So this game, it feels like, is it like Sega's answer to Mega Man, or is it, like a bit of a play on Sonic? The answer would be yes and no to both those questions, basically, because the game does have that choose your own stage aspect that Mega Man has, but that's really about it as far as that's concerned. I mean, well, you could probably say with the futuristic aspect, that's a little bit like Mega Man as well. But it's a very unique platformer, to be completely honest. And I don't think, at least in my opinion, I've never come across a platformer that had the same sort of game mechanics, for better or for worse. So I think it's a pretty interesting idea that you have to get running to build up a charge to be able to shoot or do the Voltec attack. Or I guess it's not really so much an attack as it is, well, it can be an attack, but it's also, a means of movement as well. So it's an interesting concept, but in practice, one of the problems is when you get moving and you get that charge, you speed up and start moving faster. And in this game, that can be very fatal. So if you were to compare this to, say, a Sonic game, one of the things that I feel this game kind of has going against it to a certain extent is the fact that Pulseman is a fairly fragile hero, to say the least. He can only take 3 hits, roughly. I mean, obviously there are ways of regaining your health in the game, but for the most part, 3 hits is what you can basically take. Now, on my second playthrough, I was able to actually do very well in it, and I beat it again, like I mentioned. But, even still, those aspects to the game are very unique, but it's also very slippery from a controls perspective. Now, one thing I would like to highlight, I feel like it's probably one of the better aspects of the game, is the soundtrack and probably the sound effects as well. I think they did a very good job on the sound effects for this game, in my opinion. And it just basically. I wouldn't say it was iconic or anything of that nature, but the songs were fairly memorable, and the sound effects definitely fit the game, and they weren't grating for the most part. I think there might have been a couple of songs that might have been a little bit, you know, trying to match the theme of what was going on in the background that could kind of be considered a little bit annoying, but for the most part, most of the music was actually very good, in my opinion. If I wouldn't say it was excellent, but I'd say probably very good or good for the most part. Now, one thing I will say that the graphics to this game, for the most part, are actually really good, but they do have one really glaring problem, and this is actually the stage that you see in the background is not really too bad, but there are certain stages, and this game definitely relies on a lot of flashing strobe light effects, quite a bit actually. And maybe if there was just one stage that they did that on, I could say, okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But they did it over and over and over again to the point where it was just a little bit on the obnoxious side, basically. And it just got a little bit old after a while. I wish they didn't go quite as psychedelic, or whatever word you want to use to describe all the epileptic seizure-inducing flashes that are on this game, basically. And this game is probably the poster child for all those epilepsy warnings we used to see in manuals back in the day. This game would definitely be a very good example of a bad example as far as that is concerned. As far as other than that, I mean, outside of the ultra flashy stages, I think the game was actually it was very colorful, looked very good, but they just really went overboard on those flashy stages. On my second playthrough, I was able to get through stuff like the stages that normally gave me a difficult time, like Alaska and Australia. I was able to get through them relatively well, I think, on my second go through. The only stage that was actually continued to be challenging to me was the final stage, and that one is probably the most frustrating stage in the game. Like I said, Alaska and Australia at the time, when you first come across them, they were a little bit on the frustrating side, but definitely the final stage, the very first section of the final stage is really where it got very frustrating. That first section, the actual boss to the final stages wasn't that big of a deal. In fact, for most of the stages, the bosses were fairly easy to take care of, in my opinion at least. So from that aspect, the game is moderately challenging. I've actually played more difficult games on the Genesis than this one, but there is definitely a degree of challenge here that I think that should be mentioned, basically. Having said that, there aren't any difficulty levels to speak of when it comes to choosing the game. You basically have just the single difficulty for the game, and that's pretty much it. So outside of doing like what I did and playing this on RetroArch and getting achievements, there's not a lot of replayability to the game, to be completely honest with you. But for a lot of these games, the Retro Achievement site does boost the replayability quite a bit, especially in this game's case, because otherwise I think it'd be one of those games you play through it once and then you're done. And really, at the end of the day, you could probably get through this in a few hours or so for your first try. And if you're really good, or better than I am, like I said, about 2.5 hours, and you can, just blow through the whole game like that pretty much. So there's, like I said, not a lot of replayability, but it's a pretty fun game. There are some frustrating stages, to be sure, at least initially, but overall, not a super frustrating experience, despite what you are seeing here in the background, as I was basically getting used to this first stage again. But, you know, that's kind of where I guess I'm a little conflicted. Is like, what would I give this game as far as a final score? Because I feel like the super flashy portions of the game really, really distracted heavily from the presentation, as it were. And the slippery controls, I feel, as far as a platformer is concerned, is definitely far too slippery to be considered a good controlling game, at least in my opinion. So I don't want to rate it below certain games, because I do feel it was actually a pretty fun time playing through it, you know, twice. A couple of frustrating moments, but, you know, I personally feel like something like Dynamite Heady would be a much more frustrating experience than this one. So I think I would probably rate it about the same that I did for something like Dynamite Heady, because there's not a lot of replayability as well. That's another aspect to this. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a score of 80%. I don't want to take it down too low, because I did enjoy most of the game for the most part. It is definitely unique in that regards. And when they weren't trying to blast your eyeballs and cause you to have a seizure, then the game was actually a very competently, it was good from a graphical perspective, and fairly consistently good from a musical perspective as well. So yeah, I think 80% is a pretty decent score for the game. Some of the stages were actually pretty well designed and very long, to sometimes a little bit too long, but for the most part, I think the stage design was pretty good as well. So yeah, I guess that's pretty much overall my thoughts for the game. I think it's definitely worth trying. The only way to really legally play this nowadays, or any platform that it's available on, would be the Nintendo Switch with the expansion pass. So if you don't have a Nintendo Switch with access to that, not just the Switch Online, but the Switch Online with the expansion pass, then you can't really play the game legally on any other platform. So having said that, basically, I think this is a game worth trying. I definitely think it is worth trying if you haven't ever played it before. It's a pretty decent time. Now, if you were to play it on the Switch, I don't think I would recommend playing it in handheld mode, because it just sounded very muffled in handheld mode, unless you have like headphones or something. So other than that, I'd probably play it on the TV outside of using headphones. But it's a pretty fun time, and I think it's a good addition to the Switch Online library. It gives the expansion pass a reason for existing, that it actually does have some unique games available to it. And this game actually was not on any of the Switch Minis that were released. There's two of them, and it wasn't on either of those versions of the mini console either. So Switch Online is the only place to legally obtain this game. Well, like I said, that's pretty much my thoughts on the game. Pulseman's a pretty interesting experience. Kind of makes me wonder a little bit how it felt to experience this back in the day, when you had it, the only option was to download it via the Sega channel. So that's kind of interesting as well. But I think for the time, and even to this day, it still holds up pretty well, all things considered, and it's definitely worth playing. So anyway, I'll say basically that's my thoughts. So thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.